While we typically think about Passover having 4 cups of wine and enjoying a sense of freedom, how was it actually dealt with during the Holocaust? Well, that's something we're going to explore in this episode of The Jewish Shrinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Professor Sam Levine. Welcome, Professor Levine.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so he's got an incredibly lengthy bio. He's currently at the Touro Law Center, having joined there in 2010 as Professor of Law and Director of the Jewish Law Institute. He previously served as Professor of Law at Pepperdine University School of Law and has served as the Beznos Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University College of Law. He's published 2 books and more than 60 law review articles and book chapters, and he's lectured throughout the United States on legal ethics, Jewish law, criminal law, law and religion, constitutional law, and disability rights. He has done lots and lots and lots of different things. I'm not even going to bother, but basically, he has also served as chair of the American Association of Law School section on professional responsibility, and many, including the chair of the AALS section on Jewish law, as co-chair of the AALS on section on law and religion. And it's an exceedingly lengthy bio. It's incredible. But you, really quickly, Professor Levine, so you do a lot of stuff at the intersection of Jewish law and also especially facing, I guess, people studying law. Is that a fair description?
Yes, exactly. And as you mentioned, and thank you once again for hosting me and for such a gracious introduction and welcome. I attended law school at the same time that I was attending rabbinical school at Yeshiva University. Actually, there were days that I would be uptown, I'd be uptown in the morning in Shir, and get on the train and take it downtown to the 2 schools I attended for law school, Columbia and Fordham, both on the west side of Manhattan, for those who are familiar. And it was clear to me early on, and I think it's not surprising, that within the 2 legal systems, there are so many areas of comparison and contrast. And some of my areas of scholarship and teaching do focus on drawing out some of those comparisons and contrasts between Jewish law and the American legal system.
Oh, very neat, very neat. So you went to 2 law schools?
So I got a JD, the Juris Doctor, the basic law degree at Fordham, and then I got an LLM. It's called a Master's in Law at Columbia.
Very neat. How did you then decide? Did you decide to go into professing law? Was that haphazard? Was it intentional? How did that come about?
So I think it was based on the experiences I had with professors. I worked for a couple of professors as a research assistant in Jewish law, as it turns out, and other areas. And I saw the work they do, and it really appealed to me. So I did practice for a few years. But even while I was still a law student, it was clear to me that I'd have an academic interest, that being a law professor would give me the opportunity to explore different areas of my interests. As you mentioned, I do have a variety of interests, and part of my job as a law professor can be studying and teaching criminal law and legal ethics, and also studying and teaching Jewish law.
Very neat, very neat. So that brings us to the topic, to one degree or another. This brings us to our topic, which is something certainly the somber approach, which is Holocaust, 4 cups of wine, which certainly is the 4 cups of wine, the Seder is meant as an expression of freedom, right? It's our freedom. And yet the Holocaust was very much not, freedom was not a priority for the Nazis, really. And this is based on and so really the topic we're discussing, it comes out of something that was ultimately written, but originally was a talk you gave at Washington University. Go Bears, right?
Exactly right. So I was invited to present a Holocaust memorial lecture at Washington University, specifically at the law school. And the invitation was from the law school, from the Jewish Law Students Association, a student group at the law school. Chabad on campus was involved as well, and some of the other organizations. And I thought it would be appropriate to recognize, of course, the reality of the Holocaust, but, I'm not a Holocaust scholar, it's not my field. And I certainly wanted to inform any students who are completely unaware about the Holocaust. Tragically, that does, take place.
Even in law school?
Even in law school. There are law students who kind of have a vague notion of the Holocaust. They sort of know something went on during World War II. But, the reality is, and I'm not claiming, certainly not suggesting this is the majority of students. And maybe it's just, teachers always think, oh, students these days, but there is an unfortunate reality within American society. And I think it's because students are so far removed historically, culturally, and the idea of a Holocaust is so far removed in some ways, thankfully, from
Mm-hmm.
their experiences. They can't imagine it. And
Mm,
unless they really do some research or they're told what actually happened, if they hear about it, they might assume it's an exaggeration, it's something that happened one time. And that's been my experience with American law students. And I think in
really?
some ways it speaks well of Americans as a whole. We're such
Mm,
good people, such a good society that law students as
mm,
well kind of think, oh, come on, that that it could not have been that bad. That can't really
mm,
have happened. So certainly that was one of the goals of my lecture, but I also wanted the lecture to draw on legal themes.
mm,
And there are a variety of ways of approaching the connection or connections between law and the Holocaust. And
mm,
I tried, as you mentioned, you're exactly right. The Holocaust is a very sober topic, certainly,
mm,
but I was also hoping to explore aspects of the Holocaust which give us some measure within everything going on at the time, some measure of hope. And that's where I heard about Rabbi Ushri's Chuvot, the
mm,
Chuvot Shel Mimam Kim,
mm,
and Rabbi Ephraim Ushri, had written this remarkable, it's a 5-volume work
mm.
of Chuvot that he wrote on kind of scraps of paper that he buried in the Kovna Ghetto. And then
Can
after,
I break in?
please do.
Okay, so great. So what Professor Levine here is referencing is this is a talk, Jewish Law from Out of the Depths, Adepts, Tragic Choices in the Holocaust. So this was initially something that you, of course, Washington University, and then you subsequently published, and it's based really off of you're really focused on two specific responsa of Rabbi Oshry, correct?
So I looked
Mm,
through, and I can't say I looked at every single one, but I did
mm,
look at many, many of the responses in this 5-volume work. And I tried to pick two that I think would be
mm,
particularly memorable and
mm.
meaningful for that particular audience.
And can you 5 volumes? Is there a rough sense of how many? Just a rough ballpark number of how many responses made it out?
I think there's hundreds. I think that he
Wow.
describes in the introduction the way it all came about, and he describes the writing, the chuvot. They weren't written as full chuvot; they were written on scraps of paper,
Hmm.
and he talks about how challenging it was for him after the fact to
Did he
recover
survive?
these. He survived. So
Okay,
Rabbi
so
Ushri,
uh-huh.
and you can check Wikipedia or whatever online
Hmm.
sources you trust.
Hmm.
Was a remarkable individual and lived a remarkable life. And yes, he indeed did survive the Kovna, survived the concentration camp as well as the Kovna Ghetto,
Hmm.
made his way to the United States. And I actually had an opportunity to meet
Oh,
Rabbi
really?
Ushri a number of
Wow.
years ago, not in connection with his response from the Holocaust, and we
Uh-huh.
really didn't have a chance to talk about that so much.
Uh-huh.
He was a rabbi on the Lower East Side. There's this large building, this historic building,
Uh-huh.
Beit Midrash HaGadol. You may be familiar with. It's right there on the Lower East Side,
Yeah, I've
and
heard
it
of it.
was
Yeah.
so he was the rabbi there for many years. And I
Wow.
actually
Hmm.
have an interest. This is a topic for a whole different talk, but I have a strong interest in the Jewish history of the Bronx or the history of the Jewish Bronx.
Mm.
And Rabbi Ushri had a connection there. There was a time many decades ago
Hmm.
where I went along with my brother and we interviewed different rabbis who had been connected with Jewish life in the Bronx. And for that reason, we sought out and had the amazing opportunity to speak with Rabbi Ushri.
Mm.
So yes, he did survive, and it was after the
Mm.
Holocaust, after the liberation of the ghetto,
Hmm.
where he recovered these scraps of paper, and he describes how painstaking it was to try to write out in full longhand chubot with sources and such.
Even though he
Um,
probably had no access to books at the time.
and
Wow.
absolutely, and
Wow.
he had written in his own shorthand. He describes himself, years later, and with everything that was going on, to
Hmm.
try to understand what did I mean even then? What was I saying with these literally hundreds of questions that
Mm.
he wrote, and you can imagine thousands, endless questions that came up every day in
Yeah.
that impossible conditions.
Are there so most of all of these were written while in the Covenant again? None of them were written while he was in the concentration camp, correct?
Not that I know of. I think they
Okay.
were all from the Covenant together.
Wow. Is there a sense of, I guess, who he was composing them for? Because I suspect a lot of people could just have in-person interactions, but to go to the lengths to find even just the material, the paper, the writing implements, to scope them out, and totally separate question, but also the ability to hide
Right.
them and recover them afterwards.
Right. Well, he also describes in his introduction, it's very powerful. introduction to the book. And yeah, it was 5 volumes published way back when in the original Hebrew with all the scholarly sources. And eventually it was published in a very truncated edition, really an abridged version. And he wrote an English introduction, that version, and he describes in very forceful terms why he felt it was so important. And he was talking about, Holocaust denial. This is going back decades already. And recognizing that we have to educate people. And as I described, when I spoke at WashU, and I had these experiences as well at other law schools across the country. You mentioned that I taught at Pepperdine Law School, and it was fascinating to me as a New Yorker. Pepperdine's in Malibu, it's in LA, but more so than LA, which may not differ that much culturally from the coasts. But many of the students from Pepperdine, as it turns out, come from the American South. Many Texans, students from Tennessee, from Alabama, and a number of students from American communities that were not so familiar with Jewish people altogether, with Jewish history, and who felt a very strong connection, rightly so, patriotic connection to the United States, and didn't have either culturally or ethnically or religiously a connection to Europe. So many of the students aren't Catholic, they're more evangelical Christians. And when we talk about the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, for example, and historians will debate and discuss connections between the Holocaust and other forms of anti-Semitism in Europe, we're very familiar. We, of course, are very familiar with pogroms and all kinds of massacres and situations. And many of these students who kind of heard about the Holocaust thought it was sort of a one-time only event and weren't familiar with European anti-Semitism that generally just didn't cross their radar screen. It wasn't part of their education. So I appreciate that Rabbi Ushry, for many, many reasons, thought it was so important to publish these responsa, but among others, he pointed out that people are forgetting what happened. And A, we must remember the tragedies, but B, and this is where sort of the hope comes in, where if we can draw some positive inspiration, and as you mentioned, the hope of the 4 cups of wine, Rabbi Ushry insisted that he would lead the congregation, as it were, the community within Kovna, and try his best to hold out hope and try his best to demonstrate. And he takes great pride in the commitment that the community had with everything going on, with those unimaginable circumstances, the commitment they had to keep their moral and religious obligations as best as they could.
All right. So for our listeners, so we've talked and we've danced a lot around what we're talking about. So do you mind sharing? We can even get into details. That's fine. What the specific responsum is, what the question he received, and how he answered this questioner.
So exactly right. Thank you. And the question was, it's Passover is approaching. It's going to be Pesach, and they're going to have a seder as much as they can. Apparently, they were able to obtain matzah, all important for the seder. But the question was, what do they do for the 4 cups, for the dalet kosos? Because it was impossible to get wine. That wasn't even within the realm of, and they did everything they could. They scratched and clawed and, out of desperation, tried their best to do whatever was possible. That was not within the realm of possibility. So the question was, okay, we get it. We can't have 4 cups of wine. Can we substitute something else for the wine? Can we at least fulfill this commandment, these obligations, using some other substitute for wine? And of course, the drinking show recognizes how important, well, we all know that when it comes to Jewish rituals, Jewish holidays, eating and drinking, and when it comes to the 4 cups of wine, that might be, in some ways, and I defer to you on this, but it might be the most significant ritual involving drinking. Obviously there's Kiddush, there's Havdalah, but when it comes to the 4 cups of wine, do you have thoughts on that? Certainly.
Interesting. Definitely, I would say Kiddush and Havdalah are I would say like the foundation stones, the sort of the benchmark. They're really key and sort of week after week, year round there. But as a sort of a one-off, the 4 cups definitely stand out as being really on their own. And it's also something, even Jews who maybe, I'm thinking contemporarily, maybe don't do Kiddush or don't do Havdalah. It's not part of their lifestyle. But even today, majority of American Jews will have some interaction, some engagement with the Seder. So this is something that still, even today, is
And
accessible.
I think that's exactly what I was getting at, right? Whether on a technical halachic level, which are more important, and even there, we talk to Kiddush and Havdalah, is actually drinking the wine, or is saying the Kiddush, but it has to be on wine, and we can get into all those halachic discussions, which I don't think you want to necessarily get into. But I think you're exactly right, and I was kind of alluding to that notion where within American society, again, you're the expert on this, but I think the reason Manischewitz is so well known, right, among the American Jewish community is because, as we do know, and studies have demonstrated that when it comes to Jewish observance, communities and individuals who may not observe that many other rituals are often going to be there at the Seder. And what they're often going to remember from the Seder is, back in the day, the Manischewitz. Hopefully now we've done better with the quality, all due respect to Manischewitz. But that is a memory that people have about the Seder and continue to really focus on, and for good reason. And the reason that Rabbi Ashri emphasized, and the reason his community was approaching him, was specifically during the Holocaust, during times when freedom was the last thing that they were experiencing, the furthest thing from their everyday life. They had that commitment. They wanted to celebrate, to relive the freedom from Egypt, the exodus from Mitzrayim. And that's what the four cups really stand for, more prominently, possibly than any other aspect of our rituals, even any other aspect of the Seder. So they wanted to try. So what can we do? Rabbi Ashri, we can't get wine. So Rabbi Ashri thought about it very carefully. And he describes in the responsum just how important he felt this was, how vital it was to try to find some kind of substitute within halachic parameters. And, his responsa are remarkable for how faithful he is, how careful he is to remain, even under those circumstances, on firm halachic grounds, within an understanding that when there are extreme circumstances, halachic decisions do take that into account as well. So he said, well, what can we use? And it's beer obviously would be off the table per se, because it's Passover, it's Pesach. So, but they couldn't get that either.
I'm going to make a quick note for our listeners. So I would say that and this is something that's going to actually play into our conversation. So I like describing wine as the chosen beverage of the chosen people. So wine is always considered the beverage par excellence. If there's a special occasion, there's a holiday, it's wine. With it's always the go-to, whether it's Kiddush, Havdalah, life cycle ceremonies, four cups, it's always wine. But what happens if you don't have wine? And so for our listeners, of course, we've done an episode on how beer became acceptable for Havdalah. There's a Talmudic story, but basically beer is the sort of the go-to backup, right? So there's always a second string. So beer is the second string. You don't have wine, have beer. Beer obviously is going to be literally off the table for the Passover Seder because of, unless you have date beer. So you could have date beer if there's no grains involved, but typically grains are going to be, certainly in Europe, grains are going to be somehow involved with beer. So that is going to literally be off the table. Oh, I'm going to throw in another thing because this will be important down the road, which is the phrase of the Talmud in using this loophole to use beer instead of wine is Chamar Medina. So it's literally, it's the land's wine. That's what their alcoholic beverage. Instead of wine for Sasanian Persia, it's beer. That's what they drink. Okay, every land has its alcoholic beverage, the preferred alcoholic beverage. So beer but it could also be Slivovitz. It could be vodka. It could be whatever it is. So I just had to throw that in.
Exactly. Thank you. And that's exactly right. And that was the basis for Rabbi Ashri's analysis. And, as you mentioned, beer in principle for Havdalah, for example, would be preferable, but that was off limits for two reasons. For Pesach, one beer is chametz, or maybe one that wasn't available either. They couldn't get alcoholic drinks of that sort.
Yeah. I will also say it's actually interesting. This is going far back, but Rabbi Yesserlis on his comments on the Shulchan Aruch, he says, okay, so very well aware beer is literally off the table for the four cups, but what could be the backup if you don't have wine? Mead. He suggests mead as, I don't know that anybody here listening will never have wine for the Seder, but when in doubt, go mead. So it's an option.
And maybe you'll explain to us what mead is, because I have a general sense, but
it's fermented honey. It's basically
it's
a
like
honey
a honey,
wine.
right? So it's honey wines. I've heard that phrase.
So it's literally you take honey and water, and yeast just happens, and then you let it ferment. You can throw another
that
thing,
comes into play
raisins.
here as well. You're right. So, and that's something that Rabbi Oshry, what he did at that point was say, well, let's look at another area of the halacha where we look at substitutes for wine. And as you alluded to, Kiddush not so much, but Havdalah certainly. We have these traditions of, I guess, beer. Some people, and maybe this is one of these topics that you've discussed. You've really touched so many of the bases. Those questions of during the 9 days, should you use beer? Is it better to use wine nonetheless, even though it's 9 days? All those interesting questions. So we're familiar with beer. Rabbi Ushri looked to sources that described mead, what you were just describing, which wasn't available either. There's kvass, which I guess you'd be familiar with as well.
Yeah, but that's bread. It's usually involving bread. You somehow ferment some bread.
That's like rye or something, right? So that wouldn't work either. Similar to beer. So he was really working and struggling and trying to find a substitute. And what he came up with was apparently tea. And as you described, Chamar Medina, the notion of a drink being significant, having this importance.
I would say an alcoholic drink being significant.
Okay, fair enough. So he looked to tea as being acceptable, and particularly he talked about sweetened tea sweetened with saccharin. And I think that gave it some more substance and some more significance.
Can I just add a footnote to my comment?
Sure,
so this is okay. I need to do homework. I admit I now have a new project, but I mean, it's just occurring to me now. So anybody listening, like, oh, this is a new project, is as far as I know, like tea and basically non-alcoholic beverages, whether coffee, tea, I'm trying to think of other things. I think in the Mishnah Berurah, they mentioned borscht or something like that. So but as far as I know, this is really like turn of the 20th century. So late 19th, early 20th century. I know it's mentioned both Mishnah Berurah, I think also Aruch HaShulchan. So they're now like they're lenient to allow non-alcoholic beverages being used in the place of this Chamar Medina and sort of the backup for these. I don't know how far back that stretches. I don't know if it goes earlier in the 19th century. I don't know how that developed, but I'm just saying that Rabbi Oshry has precedent. Certainly
fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah. He does cite the sources. And he does mention borscht, by the way, as you had alluded to. And I'm not sure if that was either easily available, to produce, or whatever the reason was, but he did kind of land upon this idea of, for Havdalah, that it would be okay to have the sweetened tea. And he made the point that generally speaking, the rules, the halachas of what's usable for dalakosas actually are more lenient, are not as stringent as for Havdalah. So for all those reasons, what he recommended was that they should use tea with sweetened tea with saccharin. And again, the halachic discussions are fascinating, but what I really wanted to bring out to American law students, and as you mentioned, I published this lecture in more formally written form in a Washington University law journal. And then I further published it. A number of my articles were published and collected in a 2-volume work published by Touro University Press, where I teach. And I included this essay as well, even though the topic, the 2-volume title is Jewish Law and American Law. And this wasn't quite so much American law, but I thought this was such an important historical and meaningful event for readers to be familiar with. And Rabbi Ushry talks about how one of the goals of the Nazis was, of course, the physical extermination and oppression, but he said they were also trying to break the spirit of the people, and particularly within the ghetto, the insistence and determination, the refusal to let their spirit be broken. And in that context, he describes how important it was to be able to celebrate, as anomalous as it is, as you opened the show to point out, how anomalous it was, but how important it was within those
Hmm.
confines to celebrate freedom. They weren't currently free. They hoped, and they were also anticipating that they would be themselves free nowadays.
Hmm.
But this is also part of the Pesach Seder, of course. Jewish communities haven't been free in many, many different circumstances. Unfortunately, maybe as often as we have been free
Hmm.
over the years. And that's never stopped celebrating, the Exodus, celebrating that freedom
Hmm.
and hoping toward the future as well. And in that context, he felt particularly proud, not of himself, of his community and
Hmm.
of the determination they showed to insist we have to find some way to celebrate.
Speaking of determination, one thing that caught my attention, you mentioned for this sweetened tea to even just get access to this was even just for one person was really tough to find, but to somehow find enough supply for the entire Kovno ghetto and certainly for 4 cups. I mean, I imagine you can stretch that out, but for that many people, do you have a sense of how they were able to manage to
I
gather up those
don't.
supplies? Okay.
I don't recall him talking about the details of how much and how many and who
Hmm.
got to drink it. There's an interesting additional. He does get into halachic details,
Yeah.
and he talks about interestingly how many brachos he would say on the different cups. Because when it comes to wine, we of course say 4 brachos
Hmm.
on each of the 4 cups. And I think he concludes that you'd actually say only on the first and third, the kiddush
Hmm.
cup. You'd say shahakol to begin with, obviously not
Hmm.
very, very often.
Yeah.
And then, you'd bench alakos. You'd have the shahakol after
Or the brain
benching,
of fashos, I guess. Oh, you're
or
saying with
yeah,
the third one. Well,
you,
it's
you,
well, it's interesting because usually, well, this is Sephardi Ashkenaz
yeah,
distinct. The difference is that the Sephardim say first and third cups because it's you're sort of starting and then restarting after the Birkat Hamazon. But the second and the fourth, Sephardim don't, as far as I know, they don't say it. Ashkenazim say it because each one is considered a mitzvah unto itself,
right. I
right?
think that's
So,
his. I think he's speaking within the Ashkenazic practice
right.
that it makes sense for each cup to have its own significance if it's wine, but
Oh,
not
interesting.
if I think that's what he's getting at. It
Oh,
doesn't have
wow.
that inherent value
Hmm.
other than being kiddush or being the bracha alakos. I think that's what he's
Hmm.
getting at
Hmm.
in that discussion. And he also it's clear that there was there were limits to how much quantity of even sweetened tea they could obtain, because in the same
Yeah.
tshuva he does talk about, well, other people will be making kiddush on the matzah.
Mm. Yeah.
And another halachic discussion that comes up in that context, not so much in terms of drinking, but still an interesting halachic question,
Hmm.
had to do with, okay, if they make kiddush on the matzah, should they say berei pri ha'adama on the karpas?
Hmm.
Because they're in the middle of a meal. And
Yeah.
that gets into all kinds of interesting questions because, as you
Hmm.
know, our practice is not to have kazayas of the karpas, so we won't say brain of fashos because that way the karpas perhaps kind of covers the maror in the meal to not be hadama because the maror doesn't really belong as part of the meal. So of all things, he says, well, here in the ghetto, potatoes are staple.
Mm.
So you would not say berei priha adama on the karpas if you've already washed, because
Hmm.
that really is part of the meal. While the rest of in America, oh
Hmm.
come on, this potato is not part of a meal. It's just
It's subsumed.
appetizer at
Yeah.
most. Yeah.
Hey there. I wanted to break in and hopefully you're enjoying this episode with Samuel Levine. And if you like 20th century history, well, here's a sneak peek into the post-Passover episode.
The reality is they can't enforce it.
Right.
People are drinking, right?
Also, there is something about labor, right? It's one thing to want to enforce these things, but you only have so much federal labor at your disposal.
That too.
Yeah.
So the rabbis then become, in 1926, when you think back to where are they in 1914 and where are they 12 years later, right?
Vastly different. I mean, it's worlds apart.
They're worried about what are the ethics, what's the morality here, what's public perception look like.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into the post-Passover episode, which will still be on a topic of 20th century history. Please note, we're going to be taking a little bit of a Passover break, so it'll actually be in a few weeks. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful Passover. All right, now back into the show. Both when you gave the lecture and subsequently A, to the lecture, and B, to its publication in written form, have you received any, can't use the words. Okay. Both at the lecture you delivered and also subsequently to the lecture, as well as in its printed publication, have you received any interesting feedback, comments? I mean, obviously you mentioned you teach it, but
and that's a great question. And it's a really good question because we law professors are fond of saying that when we publish articles, there's like a couple of people who read them. It's sort of our inside, academic joke.
Yeah.
And articles can be very scholarly on kind of esoteric topics. And fair enough, usually, other scholars in our field do actually read them, but it's sort of our joke that, is anyone else going to be interested? And of all things, this is a topic that has developed some interest beyond the context of legal scholarship. And I've been particularly interested in the response among many individuals who are not Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
And they have a number of individuals have approached me and talked about how powerful they thought this lesson was, how it helped them appreciate, we often, I think when scholars and educators talk about, for example, the Holocaust, and how do you teach someone about the Holocaust, the enormity of what went on, and the scope of what went on. How do you, and there's a famous paper clips example, which was one technique, which, apparently was quite effective. And sometimes it's personalizing or taking one piece of this impossible picture and kind of humanizing it in that way. And that's the impression I've gotten, that when readers hear about this commitment within those circumstances, and it's often, not exclusively, but it's often individuals who are devout within their own religious practices. Oh, yeah. And they can relate to this notion of a commitment to religious practices and religious obligations under very trying and seemingly impossible circumstances.
Wow. I mean, I know you mentioned the Pepperdine students before. Wow. It's so fast. I mean, for me, it's hard for me to really fully wrap my head that people, even, people educated like in law students, really don't know much, haven't had much interaction. But I guess there's a certain sense it's only taught like sort of a little bit. Like as Jews, or certainly more knowledgeable Jews, more educated Jews, I guess, we've had a lot of interfacing, a lot of interaction, a lot of education around the Holocaust. But people who have, it touches in no way upon their identity. It matters in no way to their lives. They might have like 20 minutes at one point anywhere in their lives, maybe.
And to be fair, if we asked, students in Jewish day schools nowadays about the Holocaust, they'd be presumably, hopefully, very knowledgeable, either from their own personal family experience or because we do focus on the Holocaust, rightly so, as part of our educational system. If we asked them about Kashmir, how much would they really know? If we asked them about Cambodia, what would they know? So it might not be as surprising as it seems to us. How can it be? And that's exactly the danger that I think Rabbi Ashri saw, decades ago, and that we obviously see. And apparently early on, I'm no expert here again in terms of Holocaust history, but Holocaust denial is nothing new, and ignorance is obviously not new at all. And Rabbi Ashri saw this, and that was one of the reasons he said it was so important to bring this to the attention of the public.
With spring arriving, that means Passover is right around the corner. To help provide you insights and more into Jewish drinking at this time of year, where else to turn to than JewishDrinking.com? In addition to multiple episodes over the course of multiple years of episodes of the Jewish Drinking Show, there are also resources at JewishDrinking.com to provide insights, whether it's articles and more. Feel free to check out JewishDrinking.com/Passover to check out those resources. L'chaim. I don't know if he mentions this. It was one of his motivations. Like, I guess for me, why publish that? I mean, imagine to some degree it'll give a glimpse into what life, it's an angle, it's a perspective on life under that experience. At the same time, like, I'm trying to imagine who his intended audience is with that. I mean, it's probably going to be more, rabbis, maybe scholars. I don't know, for the typical, it's not like a regular teshuva or just, amongst the hundreds of teshuvot, how much of that is necessarily meant to apply in America when he got back home, or to America, I mean.
I think you're exactly right. And I think that's very much borne out by what he says is in his introduction as to why eventually, and this was decades later, that he had a number, but by no means all, of the Juvot translated and in very abridged form. And he says in the introduction, for those of you who are scholars, you have access, if you do, and you understand the original. And he encourages, scholars to read the original. So I think that was the sense he got. That, okay, it's out there, 5 volumes of Chuvot, and for people who are really interested in the halachic process and have the wherewithal to be able to understand it in the original, that's one thing. But I think he came to the realization that this is a story that has to get out there, and this is information that has to get out there. And for that reason, he decided to have a number of the Chuvot translated and abridged, into English. And he describes I think he describes the lay or more general reader.
What's the translated version of this volume?
So the translated version is called, I don't know if it's backwards on here, but appropriately enough, Responsa from the Holocaust. It's well translated. It was in the 80s. So it was quite some time after the other volumes had been out.
Not that I expect others to exist. Are there other, I mean, it's hard for this stuff to even be written in the first place, let alone survive and then to be somehow published. Are there other rabbinic responsa from the Holocaust?
Right.
Or
So there's a book called, I think, Halacha and the Holocaust. So in 1976, Irving J. Rosenbaum published The Holocaust and Halacha, and he relied heavily, but not exclusively, on Rabbi Ushry's response. So I think he did have some other sources, but it's my understanding that Rabbi Ushry's Chuvot are, certainly the leading primary source that we turn to for discussions and really technical, legal, halachic discussions. And that was also one of the reasons I felt so comfortable talking about these topics in American law school, because one of the premises behind some of my scholarship in comparing Jewish and American law, and in teaching American law students comparisons between Jewish law and American law, is that the Jewish legal system is, of course, a legal system. And that alone surprises a lot of people.
Oh, how so? How does it surprise people?
Well, here too, if you speak to, let's say, many states, the notion that law should play such a central part in religious practice and religious thought doesn't really fit with their understanding of their own religious tradition. So that in and of itself is surprising to them. And again, these are the types of understandings and approaches that we take for granted if we're so used to it. And I was taken aback one of the first times I got that response. I'm like, what do you mean Jewish law? What can that possibly refer to? And I'm like, have you read the Bible? What comes up a lot there. And the answer is sometimes, I don't pay that much attention to the first 5 books, that if someone's not Jewish, or it's there somewhere, but I'm really focusing on the stories, all kinds of answers.
Is there a difference between Protestant students and Catholic students in this regard?
In this regard, in my limited experience, I wouldn't want to generalize, though I have had many Protestant Catholic students, and there too, there's so many, sub-denominations and such.
Okay, fair.
But my experience has been, and I think this is an overgeneralization, but might, have something to it. I think, the Catholic tradition is more based on interpretation and tradition versus Protestantism, which, all else equal, is certainly much more textually based, which has interesting results for how interested they are, students from different traditions in different aspects of the Jewish legal tradition. So on the one hand, and I found this particularly at Pepperdine, where there were many evangelical Christian students who were very interested in the text. They wanted to know, what does it really say? And sometimes they'd approach me and they'd say, well, I'm told that this is what it means, but what's the original Hebrew really refer to? And my answer was, I'm not sure I want to answer. Don't ask me to tell you what your religion says. That I was very clear on. But if you want to know, the original Hebrew, I'll tell you my understanding of what it means. Where Catholic students are often a bit more interested in the teachings, the applications, and there is, of course, a canon law tradition. The popes write encyclicals, so there is a bit more of that hierarchy, of religious law, as we may call it. Certainly not within the scope and depth of halacha, of every area of life, and that's what really surprises
But at
them.
least there's a sense, a framework that for the Catholic students, they can at least get a sense of, even though I imagine halacha is much more encompassing than whatever Catholic practice is. Yeah, for the Protestants, the evangelicals will probably have no sense of it.
But that's, as you say, the depth, the scope, and the extent, the idea that Jewish law is going to govern commercial activity, the idea that, it's one thing for marriage to involve sacraments, but another thing for every aspect of your domestic life, have legal guidelines under Jewish religious law. That surprises a lot of people.
Wow. No, it's really fascinating to have that sort of very different perspective. Professor Levine, in this lecture, in this printed article, there is actually not one but two responses that you mentioned. So we've obviously discussed one. The other one is also quite fascinating, and I imagine it has elicited some fascinating responses.
Absolutely, thank you. And although, of course, the drinking show, we did want to focus on that question, and it does fascinate a lot of people because they are familiar with the Seder. There's another less hopeful, I guess, and talking about out of the depths, and the title of my lecture, Tragic Choices. So I thought it was important also to present another tshuva, which I found particularly meaningful, where Rabbi Ashri speaks about the relationship they had before being brought into the ghetto and before being brought into concentration camps with their Lithuanian neighbors, and the shock that that they had turned on people that were their friends, had turned on the Jewish community, and the hope that they had, or the attempts they had, the heroic notion they had, that maybe they can approach certain people in the community that they might trust, and they can save some lives that way. And the halachic question was it permissible for someone to put their life in danger to approach the authorities? Because there's a chance that the authorities would say, oh, we remember you, we respect you, okay, we'll save some people as you request. But there's also the chance that they'll say, how dare you? So to make that request in and of itself might be considered an affront, unforgivable affront, and obviously the consequences were clear at the time. So the question was, must someone put their life in danger to save someone else? And Rabbi Ashri looked to a lot of different sources there. He looked fascinatingly to the famous source regarding setting aside one life for another, where the Gemara says, why is your blood greater than that person's blood? So the halacha is clear. You can't kill someone else to save your own life. And he turned it on his head and said, well, why is their blood greater than yours? So you're not under an obligation to give up your life to save someone else's life. So then the question was, well, in this case, there was a potential danger, but it wasn't clear necessarily that the petitioner would be giving up their life in effort to save someone else's life. And he concluded, well, there's no obligation even to put one's own life in danger, even the potential danger to save someone else. And then turning that around, he said, is it even permissible to put your life in danger to save someone's life. And he was unsure, but he said, you know what? I'm going to give you permission. I think under these circumstances, it's such a noble thing to do. I'm certainly not going to say no. And this individual did approach the authorities and did manage to save a number of lives in doing so. So I thought that was a particularly important scenario to bring out, just to demonstrate, as we've been talking about to this audience, what the Holocaust was like in a very, very small piece, a very small window. But just some of the day-to-day decisions, the unimaginable decisions and commitments that they were going through. And here we are, we're in the 20th, 21st century, very comfortable American lives.
Professor Levine, this is, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, insightful, and really interesting. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Just to promote, your show. I think it's great you're doing this. And to promote these types of conversations. In my work teaching and writing in Jewish law, I've written a number of articles, as I mentioned, comparing Jewish and American legal topics, conceptual comparisons, intellectual comparisons. I've also written a book called Was Yosef on the Spectrum, a biblical study of the biblical character Yosef. And I think it's important to have these types of conversations. And it's great that we've come so far in just a few years. I wasn't familiar with Zoom just a few years ago. Podcasts, I guess, were around, but many of us didn't know how to handle these types of technology. And, here you are using technology in this way. And I think it's terrific that we have these opportunities.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Thank you so much. And L'chaim.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop the recording.